A visible takedown looks like proof that the platform is enforcing its boundaries. The obvious reading is simple. The rule was broken, the system detected it, and enforcement followed. That explanation holds at the level of the individual case. It stops holding once visible enforcement starts appearing alongside a growing backlog of unresolved cases. If enforcement were mainly a function of clear rule breaking, the queue would narrow as actions are taken. Instead, each visible action is followed by more review demand, which means enforcement is not closing uncertainty but multiplying it. The first shift comes from the rule environment itself. Boundaries exist, but enforcement doesn't arrive continuously. It arrives through probabilistic windows that make exposure uneven. Users do not need to know the exact boundary to respond rationally. They only need to see that some borderline behavior survives for a while, and some gets hit in public. That changes the operative question. The issue is no longer whether content crosses a line in principle, but whether it crosses a line during a moment when the system is actually looking. A rule that is intermittently visible creates an exposure incentive. Visibility becomes tied not only to audience reach, but also to the probability of triggering a reputation hit through public enforcement. That contrast matters at the structural level. The platform presents a stable boundary, but the user experiences a moving enforcement window. Once enforcement is read as probabilistic, boundary testing becomes a rational adaptation. Users probe edges not to fully violate the system, but to estimate how much exposure can be captured before enforcement arrives. Each probe feeds back into the moderation environment. Borderline cases accumulate because the system now receives more decisions that cannot be resolved cheaply at first glance. The queue starts to fill with ambiguity rather than with obvious violations. That is the measurable distortion. Enforcement resources shift from removing clear breaches to sorting contested edge cases. Visible enforcement intensifies the process instead of calming it. A public strike or takedown does not simply punish one case. It also provides fresh information about where the boundary might currently be. That creates a second contrast. Enforcement is supposed to reduce experimentation, yet visible enforcement under probabilistic conditions teaches users how to experiment more precisely. Appeal delay locks the pattern in. When reputational damage arrives immediately, but review arrives later, the cost of a mistaken enforcement decision is front-loaded onto the user, while correction is deferred into the queue. The user response becomes narrower and more strategic. Boundary testing no longer means random pushing. It becomes calibrated exposure seeking under the assumption that review, not rule clarity, will settle disputed cases. That pushes a hidden load onto the system. Moderation no longer functions mainly as ex-ante boundary enforcement. It increasingly functions as ex-post-dispute resolution. Once review becomes the place where ambiguous visibility decisions are actually settled, the queue stops being a temporary bottleneck. It becomes a core operating layer of the platform-user relationship. The platform then faces a structural inversion. What looks like enforcement strength on the surface is, underneath, rising dependence on delayed review to process the consequences of its own intermittent visibility. Users adapt again inside that inversion. They treat initial enforcement as one stage of exposure management, not as the final boundary signal, because the true outcome may only be determined after delay. That behavior produces enforcement queue pollution at scale. More cases enter the pipeline not because more actors suddenly become reckless, but because the incentive structure rewards testing what can remain visible before a delayed correction arrives. The queue then changes what enforcement means. A visible action no longer cleanly separates compliant from non-compliant behavior. It initiates a secondary contest over whether the action will hold. At that point, system order depends less on stable boundaries than on the platform's ability to keep reviewing the consequences of unstable ones. Review capacity becomes the hidden stabilizer of a rule system that appears, from the outside, to be self-executing. The equilibrium is not a cleaner boundary regime. It is escalating review dependency. Users keep adapting to probabilistic enforcement windows. Visible actions keep generating contested cases, and the platform increasingly relies on delayed review to maintain governability. The queue does not only grow in size, it begins to change in composition. A larger share of cases now originate from deliberate boundary testing rather than accidental violations, which means each new entry carries higher ambiguity and requires deeper review, tightening the system's dependence on post-hoc resolution. As ambiguity accumulates, the time horizon between action and resolution stretches further. Immediate visibility decisions trigger reputation hits, but final determination is delayed, creating a persistent mismatch between when costs are incurred and when outcomes are clarified. That mismatch feeds back into user strategy. Decisions are no longer optimized for compliance at the moment of posting, but for survivability across the delay window, shifting behavior toward content that can withstand temporary enforcement long enough to extract exposure. Each such decision propagates into the queue. Cases designed to be borderline but defensible generate longer review cycles, increasing processing time per case and amplifying backlog growth under constant inflow. Scaling amplifies the distortion. As more users adopt the same boundary testing strategy, the volume of ambiguous cases grows faster than linear, while review capacity scales more slowly, increasing the ratio of unresolved to resolved cases. This creates a structural asymmetry. The system can issue enforcement actions quickly at scale, but cannot resolve disputes at the same rate, causing enforcement to outpace verification and deepening reliance on delayed review. Visible enforcement continues to act as a signal, but the signal becomes noisier. Users observe both correct and contested actions without immediate differentiation, reducing the clarity of what the boundary actually enforces and increasing variance in interpretation. That variance feeds directly into further testing, when the signal cannot reliably distinguish between stable and unstable boundaries. Users diversify their probing strategies, increasing the diversity of edge cases entering the queue. The queue then begins to function as an information reservoir. Instead of clarifying rules, it stores unresolved interpretations, which users indirectly respond to by continuing to test until patterns emerge through delayed outcomes. At this stage, a cross-actor feedback loop stabilizes. Platform enforcement generates signals that users interpret under uncertainty. Users generate ambiguous cases through testing, and those cases reshape the enforcement environment by increasing review dependency. The system's control surface shifts. Rule clarity becomes less effective as a governing mechanism, while queue management and review throughput become the actual constraints determining system behavior. This introduces a tightening constraint. Any increase in enforcement visibility without proportional review capacity expansion increases queue pressure, which in turn increases the incentive to test boundaries before resolution catches up. The loop reinforces itself. More testing produces more ambiguous cases. More ambiguous cases extend delays, and longer delays make boundary testing more attractive relative to strict compliance. A partial tension emerges at this point. Reducing visible enforcement could dampen testing incentives, but it would also reduce immediate deterrent signals, leaving the system without a clear mechanism to compress the queue without altering its own signaling structure. As the delay window becomes a predictable feature, it becomes an operational parameter for users. Content strategies implicitly incorporate expected review lag, converting enforcement delay into a usable time buffer for exposure extraction. This shifts the equilibrium further. Enforcement is no longer a terminal event, but an intermediate stage in a longer process, where final outcomes are deferred and initial signals are treated as provisional. Queue pollution then becomes self-reinforcing at scale. Each additional ambiguous case increases overall delay, and each increase in delay strengthens the incentive to produce more cases that exploit that delay. The system tightens into a higher dependency state. Platform stability increasingly depends on maintaining a review pipeline capable of eventually resolving accumulated ambiguity, even as the very existence of that pipeline encourages its own expansion. At this point, enforcement, delay, and user adaptation are no longer separable components. They operate as a single loop where probabilistic visibility, delayed correction, and strategic testing continuously regenerate the same pressure on the system. What stabilizes is not clearer enforcement, but a system that rewards timing within uncertainty. Actions that can generate exposure before resolution and remain defensible during delayed review become structurally advantaged, narrowing behavior toward calibrated boundary testing. At the same time, strict compliance loses relative advantage. Content that fully avoids edge conditions no longer captures the same exposure upside, while still operating under the same probabilistic visibility windows, reducing its competitive position. The system begins to ignore intent and prioritize survivability across the delay interval. Cases are no longer separated by whether they violate rules in principle, but by whether they can persist long enough under delayed review to justify their initial exposure. Penalties shift as well. Immediate reputation hits no longer terminate behavior. They initiate a secondary process whose outcome is deferred, which reduces the finality of enforcement and keeps contested strategies in circulation. Under this equilibrium, enforcement is no longer the primary boundary. The operative constraint becomes the review pipeline itself, which filters behavior not by preventing entry, but by absorbing and eventually resolving accumulated ambiguity. Behavior aligns with that constraint. Users adapt to produce actions optimized for probabilistic exposure and delayed correction, while the platform stabilizes around continuous dependence on review to sustain order within its own enforcement system.